Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Today we're continuing our reading of Srimad Bhagavatam. We're beginning the third canto. I have the book for you. I have the book for you. Third canto entitled The Status Quo. Chapter 1, questions by Vidura, and we're going to do the first three texts. Number 1 is on the board. Please repeat. Shri Shuka Uvacha. Evam etat pura Krishna.
Evam etat pura Krishna.
Evam etat pura Krishna.
Evam etat pura Krishna.
Maitreyo Bhagavan Kila.
Maitreyo Bhagavan Kila.
Maitreyo Bhagavan Kila.
Maitreyo Bhagavan Kila.
Shatravanam pravishtena.
Shatravanam pravishtena.
Shatravanam pravishtena.
Shatravanam pravishtena.
Tyakva svagriham ridimat.
Tyakva svagriham ridimat.
Tyakva svagriham ridimat.
Tyakva svagriham ridimat.
Shri Shuka Uvacha.
Yishuka Uvacha.
Evam etat pura Krishna.
Evam etat pura Krishna.
Maitreyo Bhagavan Kila.
Maitreyo Bhagavan Kila.
Shatravanam pravishtena.
Shatravanam pravishtena.
Tyakva svagriham ridimat.
Tyakva svagriham ridimat.
So for the sake of time, I'm going to go directly to the translations and reports by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. So I will read the translations to the first three texts, and then we'll go back and do.
Can you repeat the words?
I'm sorry?
Can we repeat the words?
Well, I think we're supposed to end at 8 o'clock,
Ah,
and we only have 15 minutes, so we're going to skip that part. I'm going to read the translations to the first three texts, and then we'll go to the short reports. Shukadeva Goswami said, after renouncing his prosperous home and entering the forest, King Vidura, the great devotee, asked this question of His Grace Maitreya Rishi. Text 2. What else is there to say about the residential house of the Pandavas? Sri Krishna, the Lord of everything, acted as your minister. He used to enter that house as if it were his own, and he did not take any care of Duryodhana's house. Text 3. The king, Parikshit Maharaj, asked Shukadeva Goswami, where and when did the meeting and discussion take place between Saint Vidura and His Grace Maitreya Muni? Kindly oblige, my Lord, and describe this to us. So before we go on to the reports, I wanted to bring up a point here. In the first verse, Shukadeva is speaking to Parikshit Maharaj, And he says to him that after Vidura renounced his prosperous home and entered the forest, he met Maitreya Rishi and he asked this question of him. He says, this question. So when you go to text number 2, I'm sure we're all assuming that this is the question that Vidura asked Maitreya. But it's not. This next verse, text 2, is a continuation of Shukadev speaking to Parikshit. And he says to Parikshit, what else is there to say about the residential house of the Pandavas? Because if we recall, Shukadev Goswami is glorifying the dynasty in which Parikshit Maharaj has taken birth. Parikshit Maharaj is at the bank of the Ganges, getting ready to leave his body within 7 days. And one of the topics that Shukadev covers with Parikshit Maharaj is the glories of Parikshit's forefathers, Yudhishthira, Bhimasena, Arjuna, like that. And he has glorified them. And now he says, what else is there to say about the residential house of the Pandavas? Shri Krishna, the Lord of everything, acted as your minister, meaning the minister of the Pandavas. Why do we have the air conditioner on and the door open? Krishna used to enter that house as if it were his own, their place in Hastinapur. And yet he did not take any care of Duryodhana's house. And now we go to the next verse, and Parikshit says to Shukadev, where and when did that meeting between Vidura and Maitreya take place? Please describe this to us. Now, interestingly, Maitreya has not been mentioned yet, really, in the Bhagavatam. You go back to the 13th chapter of Canto 1, and Sutta Goswami does say to the sages of Naimisharanya that he just mentions, he doesn't do any description. Sutta Goswami says to the sages of Naimisharanya that Vidura left the palace in Hastinapur and went on pilgrimage. While on pilgrimage, he met Maitreya Muni. And from Maitreya, he learned transcendental lessons. That's all he says. He just very briefly mentions that incident. No description of what led up to Vidura leaving the palace. No description of what they discussed. That's back in the 13th chapter of Canto 1. Then we go over to Canto 2. So then for the rest of Canto 1 and so many chapters of Canto 2, discussions back and forth between Shukadev and Parikshit, Sutta and the sages of Naimisharanya. And it wasn't until the last chapter, 10, of the second canto, right at the end, close to the end, text 51, Sutta Goswami, where did it go? The verse before that, text 50, Shanaka Rishi says to Sutta Goswami, please let us know what topics were discussed between Vidura and Maitreya, who talked on transcendental subjects, and what was inquired by Vidura and replied by Maitreya. So, these sages of Naimisharanya have been sitting for quite a long time. And Sutta Goswami introduced the idea that Vidura left the palace in Hastinapur, went on pilgrimage, and met Maitreya in the forest. Then for the rest of Canto 1, and for 9.5, almost 10 chapters of Canto 2, he makes no mention of them, of their conversation. They talk about so many things, about the cosmic manifestation and creation and this and that. And then after all that, the sages kind of like remind Sutta Goswami, hey, could we go back and could you tell us what were the transcendental topics discussed between Vidura and Maitreya? So here at the beginning of the third canto, Sutta Goswami's referring back to Shukadeva and Parikshit's conversation. So we hear Shukadeva Goswami say to Parikshit that after Vidura renounced his opulent home and kingdom, he went to the forest, and there he met Maitreya and he inquired from him, and he asked him this question. But we don't hear what the question is until the 5th chapter of this canto. The very first verse of the canto, Maitreya is saying, Vidura asked a question to Maitreya, and it takes them till the 5th chapter of this canto to get around to that question. You wanted to say something?
What is the name of the canto and chapter?
What's the
name of this canto?
This canto is canto 3, called The Status Quo, and chapter 1 is called Questions by Vidura. But we're not going to hear Vidura's questions until the 5th chapter, at least not the questions that he put to Maitreya. So the second text then, I at first thought, oh, this is the question Vidura asked Maitreya, but then upon reading the verse, I realized it's not. It's actually Shukadeva Goswami continuing his discussion with Parikshit. And he says, what else is there to say about the house of the Pandavas, that house that you ultimately took birth in? Sri Krishna, the Lord of everything, acted as your minister. He used to enter that house as if it were his own. And he did not take any care of Duryodhana's house. Srila Prabhupada's purport. According to the Gaudiya Achintya Bheda Tattva philosophy, anything which satisfies the senses of the Supreme Lord, Sri Krishna, is also Sri Krishna. For example, Sri Vrindavan Dham is non-different from Sri Krishna, Tadama Vrindavana. Because at Vrindavan, the Lord enjoys the transcendental bliss of his internal potency. Jai Radhe. Similarly, the house of the Pandavas was also the source of transcendental bliss for the Lord. It is mentioned here that the Lord identified the house with his own self. Thus, the house of the Pandavas was as good as Vrindavan, and Vidura should not have given up that place of transcendental bliss. Therefore, the reason for his quitting the house was not exactly family misunderstanding. Rather, Vidura took the opportunity to meet Rishi Maitreya and discuss transcendental knowledge. For a saintly person like Vidura, any disturbance due to worldly affairs is insignificant. Such disturbances, however, are sometimes favorable for higher realization, and therefore Vidura took advantage of the family misunderstanding in order to meet Maitreya Rishi. So this is a nice point, that the devotee of the Lord is not disturbed by external affairs like, family problems, something going on in the world, politics, whatever. The devotee of the Lord is not disturbed and continues with their pure devotional service. However, because they're living in this world, although not of it, they are in it. So while living in this world, they may utilize the disturbances in the material world as an excuse to move on for pursuing higher spiritual realizations. So this is what Vidura did. And actually, Gokularanjana Prabhu, I actually have the book.
Oh, there's no other book.
So this actually, Prabhupada did the same thing. Prabhupada lived in family life. If we read the Srila Prabhupada Leelamrita, we can hear about the history of Prabhupada's family life, business, everything, before he came to America, before he took sannyas, before he took vanaprastha. And we hear about how there were disturbances in his material family life. But Srila Prabhupada was not disturbed. He continued with his very strong sadhana. He continued with his efforts to preach to neighbors and friends and to write articles. But he used the disturbances in family life as an excuse, if you will, to one day walk out the door, as he had so many times, walked out the door for a business trip, saying, I'll see you all later, like in a couple of weeks. And this time he left, and he didn't come back. So in the same way, Prabhupada's commenting on Vidura, that he left the palace, not because he was disturbed, but it was an arrangement for him to go to the forest and ultimately meet Rishi Maitreya. So in the purport, Prabhupada made the point that whatever pleases Krishna, whatever satisfies the senses of Krishna, is non-different than Krishna. Therefore, food, it can be really, really opulently done, beautifully cooked, and everything's perfect about it. But if it's not offered to Krishna, it doesn't satisfy the senses of Krishna, right? But if you take that same food, or even some other food which isn't so fancy, etc., and is offered to Krishna for the pleasure of his senses, now that food becomes non-different than Krishna. Prasadam. If our house, if our family, if our body, our mind, and our words are actually, truly, truly, absolutely, in an unalloyed manner, used to satisfy Krishna, then it's non-different than Krishna. Therefore, the body of the Uttama Bhakta, the body of the pure devotee, is considered spiritual. And when such a devotee leaves the body, that body is entombed in what we call samadhi. That body's not cremated like ordinary bodies are. Because that body is, in the eyes of, other devotees and disciples, that body is non-different than Krishna, in the sense of it's completely spiritualized. So here, in the purport, Prabhupada said that in Vrindavan, the Lord enjoys the transcendental bliss of his internal potency. Therefore, Vrindavan Dham is non-different than Krishna. So, what is he enjoying there? The transcendental bliss of his internal potency. And that internal potency is Srimati Radharani. So where Radharani is present, devotional service is present. Where devotional service is present, Krishna's pleasure is present. And where Krishna's pleasure is present, then the whole environment becomes non-different than Krishna. So here we are at New Talavana, and this is just another dot on the map, just another place in the material world. But because the devotees have for 45 years been utilizing this place and all of its paraphernalia and natural gifts for the pleasure of Krishna, this place is then now a dham. It's not different than Krishna. It's actually spiritual. So this is the position of Srimati Radharani, that if we bring Srimati Radharani into the picture, then things become spiritualized. She is the energy of bhakti, of devotional service. So it's that devotional service which is invoking the presence of Krishna. So that was Shukadeva Goswami glorifying the house of the Pandavas, that Krishna considered that house his own, and therefore he would enter it. So text number 3, the king, Parikshit Maharaj, asked Shukadeva Goswami, where and when did the meeting and discussion take place between Saint Vidura and His Grace Maitreya Muni? Kindly oblige, my lord, and describe this to us. Prabhupada is a 2-sentence purport. Exactly as Shanaka Rishi inquired of Sutta Goswami, and Sutta Goswami replied, so Srila Shukadeva Goswami replied to King Parikshit's inquiries. The king was very anxious to understand the meaningful discussion that took place between the two great souls, Vidura and Maitreya. So, just as the sages of Naimisharanya inquired from Sutta Goswami at the end of the 2nd canto about what were the discussions between Maitreya and Vidura, so now Sutta Goswami is referring to Shukadeva and Parikshit's discussion, where Parikshit asked the same question. When and where did they meet and what did they discuss? But that, what did they discuss, won't be brought up again until the 5th chapter of this canto. These 4 chapters are going to lead up to the history. So it's very interesting. The question is, when and where did Vidura meet Maitreya, and what did they discuss? And instead of just jumping right to the answer, well, on July 3rd of such and such year, they met at such and such a place, and here was the first question, here was the first answer, here was the second question, here was the second answer. Rather, and you have to remember, Parikshit Maharaj doesn't have a whole lot of time, so you would think they wouldn't beat around the bush, they would just like go with the cliff notes, just get right to the point. But Shukadeva Goswami takes his time. And he's going to spend 4 chapters discussing the history of what led up to Vidura leaving the palace of Hastinapur, going to the forest, and how Krishna arranged for him to meet Maitreya Rishi. So every little detail leading up to and surrounding the conversation is of the same importance as hearing the conversation itself. We just want to be like, what was the question? What was the answer? What was question number 2? What was the answer? What was question number 3? What was the answer? The Shukadeva is showing by his words that understanding the circumstances which led up to that and the circumstances which surround it are just as important. So this is the introduction then to the 3rd canto. We'll stop there, and tomorrow we'll resume with text number 4. If there's any discussion. Otherwise, today is Shiva Astami. And the rest of the program is that sometime this morning, I don't know exactly when we're going to start. They say 8 o'clock, we're going to start from 9. There will be a wedding, Shesha Guru and Bhakti Meena under the pavilion. Then at 11 o'clock under the pavilion, we begin the Yugadastami celebration. Abhishek, Arti, Kirtan, class, and Prasadam. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Prabhupada ki jai, Samaveda Bhakti ki jai, Yugadastami Mahamahasa jai. Yeah, I took this book out of I took the cover off and left it there so it wouldn't get all ripped up,
Oh, that's